Morning my daughter changed the locks. I had $43 in my checking account and a winning lottery ticket worth $2.3 million sitting in the bottom of my purse. I didn't know about the ticket yet. That part came later. What I knew, standing on the front porch of the house I had signed my name onto 30 years ago, was that my key no longer worked. I tried it twice. Then a third time, jiggling the handle the way you do when you're sure it's just sticking. It wasn't sticking. My name is Gloria May Sutton. I'm 64 years old. I taught third grade for 31 years at Pinecrest Elementary in Columbus, Ohio, and I have never in my life asked anyone for anything I wasn't willing to give back twice over. I want you to understand that about me before I tell you the rest. My husband Leonard passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't have time to prepare for much, and afterward I found myself alone in a 4-bedroom house with a mortgage I could technically afford on my pension, but only if I was careful. My daughter Audrey called me 2 weeks after the funeral. She and her husband Craig had been renting an apartment in Westerville. She said they were thinking about buying something bigger. She said it might make sense, financially, logically, practically, for us to do it together. "You'd have company, Mom," she said. "You wouldn't be rattling around in that big house alone." I thought about it for maybe a day. Then I said yes. We sold my house first. That was the agreement. The proceeds from my house, $112,000 after the mortgage was settled, would go toward the down payment on something new. Craig's parents contributed $25,000. Craig and Audrey would carry the mortgage. My name would be on the deed. That was the agreement. I have it in an email. I kept it. We found a colonial on Birchwood Lane in Gahanna. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with a silver maple I loved immediately. The sellers were an older couple moving to Florida. We closed in October of 2021. I carried a box of my kitchen things through the front door, feeling something close to hopeful. I want to tell you exactly how it started going wrong, because it wasn't dramatic at first. It never is. It started with the kitchen. I'm an early riser. Always have been. 30 years of getting to school by 7:15 will do that to you. I'd come downstairs at 5:30, make my coffee, sit at the kitchen table with my crossword puzzle. That was my hour. It had been my hour, my entire adult life. About 3 months in, my daughter came downstairs one morning while I was on my second cup. She didn't say good morning. She opened the refrigerator, looked at something, closed it, then stood at the counter with her back to me. After a moment, she said, "Craig's been having trouble sleeping because of the light under the door." I said I was sorry to hear that. "Maybe you could do your puzzle in your room," she said. "Not a question, really. Just in the mornings." I said okay. I took my coffee and my crossword upstairs, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I told myself it was fine. I was a guest in someone else's schedule. I would adjust. But here's what I've learned about adjustments. They compound. You give an inch in October. By February, you're somewhere you never agreed to be. By spring, I had stopped using the living room when Craig was home. I had started timing my laundry around Audrey's preferences. I cooked dinner twice a week, my contribution, I thought. And then one Tuesday, she told me Craig found my chicken too dry and maybe I should just let her handle the cooking. I had been cooking chicken since before Audrey was born. I didn't say that. I said okay. What I didn't know through all of this was that they were having serious money trouble. Craig worked in commercial real estate. 2022 had not been kind to that industry, and by early 2023, his commissions had dried up almost completely. I found out later, much later, that they missed 2 mortgage payments. I found out later that Craig had started borrowing against the equity in the house that had my $112,000 in it. I found out none of this while it was happening. What I found out on a Wednesday morning in March was that the lock had been changed. The night before had been ordinary. I made myself soup for dinner in my room. I'd taken to eating in my room by then, which should tell you something about how far things had drifted. I went to bed at 9:30. I woke up at 5:15, came downstairs, and walked to the front door to get the newspaper from the porch. The key didn't turn. I stood there for a moment. Very still, the way you go still when your brain is trying to catch up with something that doesn't make sense. Then I went to the back door. Same key. Same result. I tried the garage code I'd been using for a year and a half. The number had been changed. I was standing in my pajamas in my own garage on the inside because I'd slept there, and I understood, slowly and then all at once, what was happening. Audrey came downstairs about 20 minutes later. She was dressed, which meant she'd known I would be up. She had her work bag over her shoulder. She didn't look at me directly. She said, "Mom, Craig and I talked about this, and we think it might be better if you found your own place." I said, "I own this place." She said, "Your name is on the deed, and we'll work that out. But right now it would just be easier if..." And then she said something about boundaries and our space and moving forward that I stopped being able to follow because there was a ringing in my ears. I asked about my furniture. My mother's china cabinet was in the dining room. My books were on the shelves in the hallway. She said I could come back for things, with notice. I said, "Audrey, I put $112,000 into this house." She said, "I know. We'll figure it out." I went upstairs and I packed a suitcase. I packed it the way you pack when your hands are shaking and you're trying not to cry because crying will make it real. Underwear, 2 pairs of pants, my medications, my Bible, my reading glasses. I left almost everything else. I didn't know what else to do. I walked past my mother's china cabinet without looking at it, and I went out through the garage, which Audrey had opened for me, and I sat in my car at the end of the driveway for about 10 minutes before I could make myself drive. I had $43 in my checking account. My pension deposit wasn't due until the 1st. It was the 15th. I drove to a Kroger parking lot because I needed somewhere to sit and think. That's where I found the ticket. I want to explain the ticket. A few weeks earlier, my friend Cecilia, we've taught together at Pinecrest for 20 years, she retired 2 years before I did, had invited me to her church's fundraising luncheon. There was a raffle, not a Powerball, not a state lottery. A charity raffle run by the Central Ohio Hospice Foundation, one of those high-dollar affairs where the tickets are $50 each and the top prize is real. I bought one ticket, slipped it in my purse, forgotten about it entirely. I hadn't opened the envelope they'd mailed because I assumed I hadn't won. I never win anything. I sat in the Kroger parking lot and opened the envelope because I needed something to do with my hands. The prize was $2.3 million. I read it 3 times. Then I took out my phone and looked up the Hospice Foundation and called the number on their website. A woman named Sandra answered. I told her I had a ticket and I needed to verify it. She asked for the number. There was a pause. Then she said, "Miss Sutton, you'll want to come into our offices. You've won the grand prize." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after I hung up. I want to tell you what I felt because people always ask and I don't think the answer is what they expect. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like justice had arrived on a white horse. I felt tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing other people's comfort for so long that even good news feels like another thing to navigate. Then I thought about Audrey standing at the bottom of the stairs with her work bag, already dressed, not looking at me. And something in me went very quiet and very clear. I called Cecilia. She was at my side within the hour. Cecilia is the kind of woman who, when you tell her you've just been put out of your home and also won $2.3 million, says, "Okay, first things first," and means it. First thing was a motel, the Fairfield Inn off Route 161. She put it on her card. Second thing was a phone call to her nephew, who was an estate attorney in Dublin. His name is Marcus Webb. He is 38 years old and he has a way of listening that makes you feel like every word you say is being filed away in exactly the right place. I met him the next morning. I brought the raffle ticket, the original deed to the house on Birchwood Lane, and the email chain from 2021 where the financial arrangement had been laid out. He read everything without saying much. Then he said, "Ms. Sutton, you have options." I said I was listening. He explained that because my name was on the deed, I retained legal ownership of a portion of the property. He explained that my $112,000 contribution was documented, which meant it was recoverable. He explained that the lock change, without my consent, without a court order, was legally problematic for Audrey and Craig. He said this gently, but without softening it. They made a mistake. In the meantime, I needed to claim my prize. Marcus came with me to the Hospice Foundation offices 3 days later. The foundation's legal counsel was there and the process was straightforward. The ticket was legitimate, the prize was real, and after taxes and the lump sum election, I would receive approximately $1.4 million. The funds would take roughly 3 weeks to process. I stayed at the Fairfield Inn. I didn't tell Audrey where I was. She called once, the day after she put me out. A brief voicemail. "Mom, I just want to make sure you're okay." I didn't call back. I didn't know what I would say, and Marcus had advised me, gently, to let him handle communications for the time being. I want to tell you about those 3 weeks because people tend to skip over that part, the waiting, the in-between, and I think it's actually the most important part. I had a $79 a night motel room and a pension check, and Cecilia bringing me casseroles every other day. I had more time than I'd had in years, which sounds like a gift and partly was. I walked every morning along the trail by the Scioto River. I read 3 books. I started sleeping through the night, which I hadn't done in almost 2 years. I thought about Leonard. He would have been so angry on my behalf, and then he would have said something funny and practical, the way he always did, and I would have laughed and felt better. I missed him every day. I missed him in that specific way you miss someone when something big happens and there's no one else in the world who would react exactly the right way. I thought about who I wanted to be on the other side of this. I did not want to be small about it. I did not want to make decisions out of rage, even if rage was the easiest emotion available. But I also did not want to pretend that what had happened to me was something I could simply absorb and move past. Audrey called 3 more times. Craig called once. I didn't answer any of them. Marcus filed the legal paperwork to assert my interest in the property and formally document the financial contribution. He sent a certified letter to Craig and Audrey. 2 days later, Craig called Marcus directly. Marcus told me Craig had been cooperative in his manner, but evasive on the specifics. He mentioned they might be open to a buyout. The money arrived in my account on a Thursday morning. I sat in the motel room and looked at the balance on my phone. $1.4 million. My whole body felt strange, not giddy, not triumphant, just very aware of myself, sitting in a room with orange curtains and a heating unit that clicked every 4 minutes. I called Marcus. I told him I was ready to move forward. I found my apartment on a Friday. A real estate agent named Donna showed me 4 units in Upper Arlington, and the third one I walked into, I knew. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, big windows facing east, so the morning light comes in, clean and wide. There's a breakfast nook with just enough room for a small table and 2 chairs. I put an offer in that afternoon, cash. I also, with Marcus's help, sent Cecilia a check for 6 months of mortgage payments on her house. She tried to refuse it. I told her it wasn't negotiable. About 10 days after I moved in, still surrounded by boxes, still figuring out where things went, Audrey showed up at my door. I didn't know how she'd found me. I suspect she asked Cecilia, and I suspect Cecilia thought it was the right thing. I don't hold it against her. Audrey looked tired. She'd lost some weight. She stood in my doorway and looked around at the boxes and the new furniture I'd started buying, and something moved across her face, something I couldn't fully read. She said, "Mom, I need you to understand how much pressure we were under." I said, "Audrey, I know about the missed mortgage payments. I know about the equity line." She looked down. "You put me out of my home," I said. "You changed the locks on a house that had my name on the deed and my mother's furniture inside it. You did that with no warning, no conversation, no respect for what I had given you. I had $43. I had a suitcase." She started crying. I recognized it, the particular crying of someone who feels guilty and also, underneath the guilt, still believes that circumstances explain behavior. I handed her a tissue. Then I sat down in one of my new chairs and waited until she'd composed herself. "I love you," I said when she was quieter. You're my daughter. That is not something that turns off. Then can we? I'm not finished, I said. She stopped. I have worked with Marcus to reclaim my financial contribution to that property. That process will proceed regardless of this conversation. It's not a negotiation, it's documentation of what was mine. I paused. As for the rest of it, the relationship part, I need you to understand that things will be different now. I am not going back to eating dinner alone in my room. I am not going back to timing my laundry and apologizing for making coffee at 5:30 in my own house. If we are going to have a relationship, it will be between equals, not between a mother and a tenant, not between a guest and a homeowner. Equals. She nodded. She was still crying, softer now. I'm not saying never, I said. I'm saying not yet, and not on the old terms. She left after about 20 minutes. I stood at my east-facing window and watched her car pull out of the lot. I made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at my breakfast nook table. I looked at the morning light coming through the glass. Craig never called. I heard through Audrey much later that he'd been embarrassed, not about what they had done, but about the legal process, about having to negotiate with Marcus over numbers that, I suspect, he'd assumed I would never be in a position to enforce. Men like Craig recalibrate when the leverage shifts. I felt nothing in particular about that. What I felt something about was this, the silver maple in the backyard of the house on Birchwood Lane. I still think about it sometimes. I had one winter and one spring with that tree. I watched it go bare in November and come back in April, and it was one of the most beautiful things I'd seen in years. I don't have a backyard now. I have a second-floor apartment with east-facing windows. But I have a potted Japanese maple on my balcony that I bought at the nursery in Grandview, and on mornings when the light hits it just right, I think that's enough. I will tell you the thing I did not expect. I expected that money would feel like power, and it does. That's not a lie, it does. There's a specific relief in knowing that I will never again have $43 and a broken suitcase lock and nowhere to go. That relief is real, and I am not pretending otherwise. But what surprised me was how much of the healing had nothing to do with the money at all. It had to do with that walk along the Scioto River alone every morning for 3 weeks, deciding who I was. It had to do with Cecilia bringing me a casserole on a Tuesday night and sitting on the edge of my motel bed and telling me I was allowed to be furious, actually furious, and not fold it up and put it somewhere manageable. It had to do with Marcus Webb looking at a file of my life, emails and deeds and financial records, and saying plainly and without drama, you have options. I am Gloria May Sutton. I taught 31 years of other people's children how to read and how to be decent. And somewhere in those years, I forgot to apply the same standard to how I was being treated. I won't make that mistake again. My coffee is good in the mornings. The light is exactly right. If you're in a situation where someone is making you smaller, slowly, incrementally, so gradually you almost don't notice, I want you to pay attention to the almost, because there is a moment, early enough, when you can name what's happening and say, no, I waited longer than I should have. But I want you to know, even if you've waited, even if you're standing at the end of a driveway with a suitcase and $43, it is not too late. I know that now in my bones. If this story meant something to you, I'd be glad if you left a comment below. I read every single one. And tell me, have you ever had to rebuild something from scratch? I'd like to hear about it. I'll be right here. I've had a lot of time to think about why things went the way they did, not just what happened, but why it was always going to happen, given who everyone involved chose to be. Audrey didn't put me out of that house on Birchwood Lane because she was a bad person in some simple, cartoonish way. She put me out because she and Craig had been making small choices for years, choices that said, her comfort matters less than our convenience. Her presence is a problem to be managed. Her investment in this house is something we can deal with later. Every one of those choices was small. Every one of them was a decision. And decisions like that don't stay small. They accumulate into something you eventually have to live with, and eventually they come due. That's not fate. That's not luck running out. That's just the way things actually work when you pay close enough attention. What you practice, you become. What you tolerate in yourself, you eventually do more of. Craig and Audrey practiced treating me as though I were invisible, and they got very good at it, and then one morning it was easy to change the locks, because they'd already changed something else a long time before that. I think about that when people ask me if I'm angry. The honest answer is, I was. I sat in a Kroger parking lot in my pajamas, and I was angrier than I have been at anything in my 64 years. But anger by itself is just weather. It tells you something is wrong. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. What I've learned, slowly and not without a lot of sitting still and being uncomfortable, is that the question after anger is always, and now what will you do? I chose to use it. I chose to call Marcus. I chose to document everything, to assert what was mine legally and financially, to stop pretending that the terms of our arrangement could just evaporate because it was inconvenient for someone else. That took something I want to call intelligence, but I think it's really just clarity. The willingness to see a situation plainly without softening it to make yourself feel better. Cecilia had it. She walked into that motel room and she didn't say, "I'm sure Audrey didn't mean it that way." She said, "You're allowed to be furious." That was the most useful thing anyone said to me in those 3 weeks, because it gave me permission to think clearly instead of managing everyone else's feelings, which is what I've been doing for 2 years. The thing I want to say to anyone who recognizes something of themselves in this story is, your clarity is not cruelty. Naming what happened to you is not the same as being hard-hearted. Protecting what is yours, financially, emotionally, in terms of basic dignity, is not selfishness. I spent too long confusing kindness with self-erasure, and those are not the same thing at all. Gloria Sutton has east-facing windows now. The light comes in every morning exactly the way I like it. I made that happen at 64, starting over with a suitcase and a winning ticket I didn't even know I had. If I could do it, I want you to believe that the version of that story, your version, whatever it looks like, is also possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. That's what I know for certain.